Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. In my last series, we created a REST API for creating, retrieving, updating, and deleting to-do items. But now, we will now create a user interface that will communicate with the API that we just created and display it. And we're going to be using Next.js. All right, so if you need the source code for the API, I will have it in the description. But I hope you guys enjoy this. This should be fun. Alright, so if you already know what Next.js is and want to get straight into the code, you can probably skip this video. This is going to mostly be an intro to Next.js and why we're going to be using Next.js. So yeah, if you already know this stuff, you can skip it. Now, just to keep it short and sweet, what is Next.js? Next.js is simply a React framework that gives you building blocks to create web application. Now, what are these building blocks? Well, let's see. So these building blocks, right? Like, why are we using Next.js? Well, first, the coolest thing about it to me is the fact that it comes with built-in routing. And we're going to touch this a little bit more as we start the code, but just know that you don't have to get any sub packages or download npm install anything to get routing into this. By default, Next.js already comes with a cool way of creating routes to create different pages. So that's awesome. The second thing is image optimization. It allows for faster page loading when using images and provides some stability. We're not going to really use images in this project, but just know that Next.js does have image optimization. It comes with fast refresh while you're coding and you're editing things and you're saving. It updates and refreshes pretty fast, right? So that's perfect for the developer experience, and that comes right out of the box. It already has integrated ESLints. So that means that, if you want your code to look in a structured manner, pretty consistent throughout, Next.js already comes with ESLint, and there's a configuration file that you can use to edit the way you want your code to look like. But by default, this already, this already comes with Next.js once we once we install the initial boilerplate for Next.js. And lastly, it handles well with modern browsers. I know as a front-end engineer that sometimes whenever you're coding, sometimes whatever you use doesn't necessarily work with Internet Explorer or work with certain browsers, but Next.js allows us to be able to use our application on different browsers without any issues. So right out of the box, Next.js handle that for us. So these are some cool out of the box things on why Next.js is cool, and which is why we're going to use it, right? We want all of this stuff so that we can have a faster developer experience, and is also pretty great with SEO. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why it is great with SEO, which is just search engine optimization. That's what SEO means. So we're going to talk about why Next.js is great with handling that, but these are some cool things right out of the box that Next.js provides. Alright, so another feature that Next.js provides is pre-rendering, and I thought it would be pretty important to have this on its own page because it is a very important feature that Next.js provides. But before I dive into that, I want to talk about other types of rendering that is provided currently, which are server-side rendering and client-side rendering. Now, server-side rendering is a common method that is used to display information onto your screen whenever you go onto a website. But how does it get that information onto your website or onto your page? Right? So what is being done is on server-side rendering is that it generates the HTML file on the server side, and whenever you go to a page, it makes a request to your server and retrieves that content, that file, to be displayed on your page, right? Because you made a request for that page, it's going to get that HTML file from the server and display it once it's received. The issue is that there's things that it depends on when it comes to speed, right? It can either depend on your internet speed, the location of the server that you're trying to retrieve that file from to display, how many users are trying to access the site at a given time, and how the website is optimized. So there's different things that may enable slow speeds when it comes to server-side rendering, and that may cause problems, right? Another rendering method is the client-side rendering, and this is more of a newer side of rendering. And what this is the browser receives an empty bare bone HTML file from the server, and also receives an instruction from the server or JavaScript instructions to construct the UI on the client side. So that's why it's called client side rendering, because you just receive a bare bones HTML file, and then you receive a JavaScript that will generate that on the client side, right? So these are two different approaches that you can use, and the client-side rendering approach is often used in React frameworks, or React and Vue.js. So that's more of a new approach that's being done. But Next.js provides a way of doing pre-rendering, which means that by default, Next.js pre-renders every page. That means Next.js generates the HTML file before it even, or at build time, before it even make a request for the HTML file. So that just makes it so much quicker because look, the HTML file is already generated. All you gotta do is ask for it, and it's already here. And that allows for better performance, right? Because everything is already generated, and it provides for better SEO. And I've been saying SEO multiple times. What is SEO? SEO just means search engine optimization. I could use a whole video to go over what SEO is, but you can just think of SEO, which is search engine optimization, as a way that search engines use to pretty much display your website in the rankings. So when you go on google.com and you search for, if you put Facebook in the search bar, what usually comes up, right, in the search results? Facebook.com. Facebook.com has the highest, search engine optimization ranking because it is, it's a viable website, right? And they made sure that their SEO ranking is high, that Google is able to index and crawl through their website and see that Facebook is used very often. So the goal of SEO is to create a way of increasing your ranking position in a search engine result, right? So whenever somebody put the name of your website, you're in the search engine, your website is the first thing that pops up. And what allows for that is, having a high SEO ranking. And to do that, it's better to have a website that's easily crawlable and easily indexed. And like I said, most of that probably doesn't make sense. I'll probably make a separate video on what SEO is, or I'll probably leave an article in the description on what it is. But just know that SEO is just a way to allow for these search engines to rank your website. So whenever somebody's searching for your website, it's the first thing that will pop up if your ranking is high. Now, if you have a bad SEO score, that means your website will be hard to find when people search for your website in the search engine, such as Google. So Next.js will be perfect if you want to enable a way of increasing your SEO score or SEO ranking, right? So Next.js uses pre-rendering by default, and it will generate your HTML file at build time, so that whenever your page is called for, it's automatically going to provide the HTML. Now there are two forms of pre-rendering. There's the recommended approach, which is static generation. The HTML file is generated at build time and will be reused, so it'll be cached for each time it's being requested. And then there's the server-side rendering, which is the HTML is generated on each request. The recommended approach is the static generation, because if it's already going to be reused plenty of times, it's already going to be generated, and obviously that will increase the speed. Now, just in case you don't know what build time is, because I just said build time when it comes to static generation, build time is just means that when you take your website into production, when you run the command next builds and it generates the most optimized version of your application, this is when the pages are going to be generated. And that means that once this is ready for production, those HTML files will be ready to be used, and every single time there's a request, it will just reuse that same file that was generated, right? And it'll be cached somewhere so that the next time somebody makes the same request for that same page, it's already available, right? It's quick, easy. So yeah, cool. And just in case you want to know what's the difference between build time and runtime, build time is when you're building an app for production, and runtime is when the app is actually running in production, like it's continually running. All right. So I had some confusion when I first started on what those two terminologies mean, so I just thought it would be perfect to bring that up. So you're probably thinking to yourself, it's generating these HTML files at build time, so what if, as a user, I need to get external information after it's being built, right? So they already thought ahead about that. We have a thing called get static props and get static paths, right? So get static props just means that your page is going to depend on external data, and there's a way that Next.js allows us to retrieve that external data during that pre-render cycle. So we're going to look into a way of creating a function called get static props, which will make a call to retrieve that external information, And on pre-render, it will fetch that data and it will provide it to the page as a prop, which we can use just like a regular prop, right? If you have some experience with React, a prop is just data that's being passed through to our page. So get static props just allows us to fetch that external data before the page is even pre-rendered or while it's being pre-rendered, and it will provide that data in a way called a prop that we can use for our page, and we can display it or we can do whatever we need to with that data. We talked about routes before, so we have another thing called get static paths, which if we need to use some dynamic routes, say for instance the user passing ID inside of the URL to retrieve some information using the path, we can use get static paths to get that information during pre-render based on that specific static path. We can also use a function to retrieve that information. We're not going to use get static paths during this tutorial, but I just want to show you guys that if you do have dynamic routes, there is a way that you can get the external data that you need during pre-render. Alright, so let's take a look at the get static props function. This is a little snippet, and if you don't understand it right now, you don't have to worry about it. We're going to go over it more later on, but I just want to show you guys the initial setup for it. So the first couple lines, which is just the export default function home, this is pretty conventional for displaying pages. So this is going to be the function that we use to actually show the information onto the page. But if you see curly brackets that says to do data, this is the props that we're extracting that will be used to render the data onto the screen. And where do we get this to do data, right? We're going to get that from this get static props, right? We want to fetch the to do data before the screen or while the screen is being pre-rendered. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the async function get static props, and what we're going to do is make a call using fetch to our API that will return all of the to-dos information, and we're going to store that into a const variable called to do data. And then what we're going to do now that we have the data is that we're going to pass that to do data as a prop, right? And we saw that we were able to extract that prop called to do data on the first line. And what we're going to do in this get static props function is that we're going to return that information that we just fetched as a prop, and then that's going to make it retrievable in our function to be displayed when the screen renders. So get static props makes the call to our API, it gets the information, and it's going to pass it as a prop, and we're going to call it to do data, and then now we can retrieve that prop, and you can see that the name matches, right? You see to do data in the get static props function, and we see it in the function as we're extracting it, and it has to be the same name, and we're going to use that to do data in our page to display our to-dos. So this is just a little snippet. If you don't get it now, it is fine. When we start doing it line by line, it'll make more sense. But I just wanted to show you guys exactly how it's being used. So cool. Another thing that I wanted to go over is routing, because we're going to do a little bit of it in our application. But like I said, I'll just do a little summary of it right now. But if you don't understand it, then I'll go over more when we start coding. So how do we define routing in Next.js? Like I said, it comes right away out of the box, and it's pretty cool, right? So initially, to get to the first page routing wise in Next.js, we can just create an index.js file in the parent folder, and the folder is going to be called page. And once we define that index.js in the page folder, it's going to define our initial routes, and that's just going to be the default empty URL. Like there's no specific endpoint after the basic URL, and our URL is going to be localhost 3000 because by default it's going to be hosted on port 3000. But by default, if we put an index.js in the page folder, then it's going to be the initial point into our application, or the initial page in our application. So that could just be like a home page, yada yada yada. But the initial index.js in the parent folder creates the home. You can think of it as the home page for our application, the initial page for our application. Now, a cool thing about Next.js is that to start creating these specific URLs, we can place a folder inside of our page folder So we can start nesting folders inside of the parent page folder, and this will allow us to start defining specific URLs. So if we create a folder inside of our page parent folder, say for instance we call it to do, this will create a pretty much another endpoint of our URL, and it's going to be called the name of the folder that we created. So in this case, if we created a folder called to do, it's going to be now localhost 3000/to do, because our folder is to do. And then we can start defining. We can put an index.js in that to do folder, and that will define how the page will look like once we make a request to go to the to do endpoint in our front end. And the content within that index.js will be served to the user. So this probably sounds like a bunch of hoopla right now, but I just wanted to give a little summary. Once we start going into the code, it'll make a lot more sense, and I'll make sure to go nice and slow so you guys understand. But I just wanted to show what are the cool things out of the box that Next.js provides and how you can use them. But let's actually get started. So in the next video, I'm going to be going over how we can make our homepage, how we can start defining some specific fonts, how we can leverage Google Fonts and get that into our application, and this actually create the boilerplate for our Next.js application and get that into a editor. I'm going to be using Virtual Studio Code, but you're free to use whatever you want. I just like Virtual Studio Code. So let's get started.